Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Story, the value of architecture in Hawaii. My name is Angeline Joven Mauga, a designer at G70, and I am your host for today's podcast. This is our first session in a new podcast series geared towards engaging young architects and emerging professionals in chronicling the history and life lessons of some of Hawaii's most established architects. Let's Talk Story is written and produced by AIA Honolulu and is made possible by a grant from the AIA College of Fellows. The idea was conceived by the Emerging Professionals Committee as a way to connect various generations and perspectives and share ideas of architecture in Hawaii. Today's podcast studio and equipment is provided to us by WCIT Architecture, Detail, and AINA Archaeology. We would like to send a big mahalo to these three organizations. Today, we are interviewing John Hara, FAIA and 2015 recipient of the AIA Northwest and Pacific Region Medal of Honor for a Lifetime Achievement. John also received the AIA Hawaii Medal of Honor in 2017 from the Hawaii Architectural Foundation. John was born and raised in Honolulu, in immigrant housing just across Nuuanu, where the Poly Safeway is now. He received his Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania in 1962. After spending a few summers abroad in Europe, he returned home to Hawaii in 1964. At the start of his career, John has worked for architects John Tatum, Tom Creighton, former editor of Progressive Architecture, Charles Ty Sutton, FAIA, and Oceanic Properties. He opened the doors to his own architectural practice, John Hara and Associates, in 1970. John also taught as a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa School of Architecture between the years 1970 and 72, and again in 1984 to 1992. John continues his practice in present day. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. John Hara, FAIA. John, I first want to start out by talking about your early childhood encounters with architecture. Can you tell us about the first time you perceived architecture or took an interest in it?
How I perceived architecture, well, initially my father was an architect, and because of that, you sort of generally, you think you know what architecture is. But in terms of taking an interest in it, it happened when I went to college.
Yeah, and we talked about a little bit about it before, that you actually attended University of Pennsylvania,
Yes,
and it
yes.
wasn't for architecture.
Yes, the reason I went to the University of Pennsylvania because primarily of my interest in music. I went to the Academy of the West in Santa Barbara, California, my junior year. To go back further, my first job in high school was playing with the Honolulu Symphony.
That's right.
And I began developing my interest in music at that time. And in my junior year in high school, I went to the Music Academy of the West in Santa Barbara, California, and played music
Yeah.
at the academy. I was interested in going to the East Coast, primarily the University of Pennsylvania, because most of the major music orchestras were on the East Coast, in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston.
Right.
And that was the start of music, so to speak.
Yeah. And your instrument was the oboe.
Yes.
And I know you had a lot of joy kind of talking about your experience with music. Tell us a little bit about what happened afterwards when your focus shifted from music pursuits to architecture.
Well, it was interesting. When I first went to the University of Pennsylvania, I auditioned for the University of Pennsylvania Orchestra, and I was selected for a double and went to the first rehearsal. And first flutist was someone named Sue. So in terms of introduction, I said, "Hi, I'm John." She said, "Hi, I'm Sue." Turned out to be Sue Ann Kahn, Luke Kahn's daughter.
Right.
At that time, Mr. Kahn had was in the middle of his career. And, I was 17 years old at that time, so obviously I did not know who Mr. Khan was.
Yeah.
But that was the beginning of interesting times. I remember playing chamber music in Sue Khan's house and going there and seeing these etchings on the wall and asking, who did those drawings? They're beautiful. She said, oh, my father. Oh, okay, now where were we? And we continued playing.
Just in passing.
But at the University of Pennsylvania, I was doing both. I was playing music, and it was in the architecture program. As an architect, I had these incredible instructors.
Yeah.
One was Mrs. Sasha Nowitzki. She was originally from the Bauhaus. Her husband was Matthew Nowitzki, who was the original architect selected to design Chandigarh in India. He died tragically in an airplane crash, but Sasha Nowitzki was an incredible friend of mine because I was from Hawaii. She took extra care for what I did.
Yeah.
It was interesting because in terms of the culture of the East Coast at that time, I remember our first project was design a row house. Well, coming from Hawaii, I had no idea what a row house was. But, I eventually became to know more than what a row house.
Oh, that's so fun. And I liked hearing that story because it happened so candidly. And
Yes.
you describe it as though this awesome thing just happened and you walk away from it and continue with
Yes.
music.
Yes.
So that was at University of Pennsylvania. And after you continued your studies, you talked a lot about traveling through Europe and also working here and there for various professionals. Can you talk to me a little bit about the importance of traveling to see architecture and maybe just to see how different lives and cultures operate?
Yeah. Well, as part of the program, the School of Architecture at Penn, we had an incredible staff of faculty members. At that time, it was called the Philadelphia School. And the emphasis was on, history and really architectural design. And instructors there became very much part of the educational environment. Specifically, Robert Venturi was one of the architectural critics there, and he his focus at that time was on history and things related to history. And also at that time, he had not built very much at all. He was just starting his own professional career. But his perspective of history was incredible.
Right.
The other people were, for example, Grant Mason, who wrote about the history of architecture and also lectured. As part of the architectural curriculum, the history of architecture. So the educational experience was something. In addition to, Mr. Khan, there was people who worked for Mr. Khan on staff, Mr. Jurgala, who was at that time also teaching at Penn. It was very inspirational.
Yeah, lots of great people at that university.
Speaking of my time in Europe, I graduated from Penn and decided, to go back to Hawaii was, at that time, 18 hours by plane. To go to Europe was 6, so it'd be much easier to go spend some time in Europe. And one of my professors was from the south of France. His name was Leon Loster. I asked him if I could get a job, and he said yes. So I spent the summer working for him in southern France. And
beautiful place.
He was the start of my stay in Europe. Because this is the south of France, every weekend I'd travel someplace to see history, which is always always part of that part of the country.
Did you seek music or other things?
At that time I still was playing music and also practicing architecture.
Yeah.
At the end of the summer, Mr. Lossiter had to return to Penn to teach, so he suggested he made a recommendation for me to go to Europe, or to Zurich, Switzerland, and he recommended me to this particular office. And so after traveling for a month in the summer, I ended up in Zurich, in a more or less international office there.
Wow.
It was a rather large office. It's called Steiger and Steiger. And it was also an international office. I remember coffee hours, people used to speak Swiss, Swiss German, French, Italian, and also English.
The whole pot.
Right.
Wow.
And so that was another kind of experience. And being in Zurich allowed me to travel again every weekend to someplace to see the history of architecture.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, it's so different to practice outside of the United States.
Yes.
And that was at the start of your profession too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, the experience working in Zurich, I met people who had just immigrated from Budapest at that time, which was having a real problem. And a dear friend of mine was from Japan, or he was working there at that time. So he didn't speak much English. I didn't speak much Japanese, so we spoke to each other in bad German. It was very, very interesting.
Happy middle.
And since that time, on our many trips to Japan, we have always met. Most recently was 3 months ago, Christmas in Japan.
Oh, that's sweet.
Yes. But again, continuing on, after finishing Zurich, I decided to work in another part of Europe and found a job in Paris.
It was at a firm in Paris?
Yes, and this is an international firm, Candelish, Woods and Josek. Very interesting. Again, another international kind of firm. People didn't speak French very often, but again, people talked a lot about architecture and were there for all kinds of reasons. That was an experience. And it was also 2 blocks away from where my apartment was.
So you can just walk down the street.
Yes.
Enjoy the city a little bit before work. Yeah, some good memories. And I'm sure the things that you've learned working at those firms, you kind of carry with you coming back to Hawaii.
Yes.
After all of that travel.
Yes.
So I think it was in 1964 that you actually came back to Hawaii. And you mentioned that working for architect John Tatum for several years.
Yes.
Yeah. How was it like, your first couple years back, you've had all of this experience and inspiration from Europe, and now you're back home and practicing architecture?
Well, I was rather glad to come back home because I was a little bit tired of living out of the suitcase.
A little tiring.
In fact, I had a job in Philadelphia on the way back. However, when I got back here, I decided to stay. Working in Tatum's office at that time were some dear friends of mine. One, of course, you know or you know of him, Gus Ishihara, founder of Group 70.
Yes.
And we were very close friends. We lived at Queen Emma Apartments. And we used to drive to work every day, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But that was kind of the sort of experience. We talked a lot about architecture because in those days, people did talk with each other. When you were at the university, what did you like best?
Well, when I was at the university, we had people like Joyce Noy, who, similar to what you said, talked a lot about architecture history and also driving design from culture. And I felt that was unique to the experiences that some of my friends that studied architecture out of state, it was different from their experience in architecture school out of Hawaii. So to attend University of Hawaii at Manoa with the intention to kind of practice in Hawaii, I thought that it was fundamental to learn from her experiences and really make it intentional to be informed about kind of the past history of the place and also the people and the cultures that live here. So I thought that was a really interesting thing that was different about the university. Yeah.
Are you aware of, has the school changed since you left it?
Oh, maybe it has. I know that we've had different people that are interested in architecture in Hawaii, and so that drives a lot of different professors from out of state to kind of have interest. But I think the one thing that's consistent throughout the years is the respect towards the culture. I am thankful that a lot of the professors share that sentiment of wanting to make sure we design right, or we're right with culture and we're right with place. And I hope that kind of continues on in the practice going forward. In 1970, John Hara Associates was established. And that was kind of a culmination of all of your experiences and now making this decision to have your own firm. Can you explain the choice to open up your own practice instead of maybe looking for somebody else that you wanted to work for or a different firm that you wanted to work for?
Well, when you first start your practice, it's essentially very small projects. So I had one or two houses, and I figured, I'm doing this by myself. Why don't I do it open up an office? And one of my relatives was involved in certain kinds of development, and he gave me a lot of work. So that's how I started my own practice. So,
I imagine it was very hands-on for these residential projects.
Right, and it was at a time where there were different kinds of projects I was working on. I mean, some were very, very large, some were very, very small, and the combination thereof was interesting. And together with some people I worked with John Tatum to join to work with me, which is very good.
To collaborate.
Yeah. One of my experiences in Zurich, Switzerland, and also at Penn, I was fascinated with the work of Alvar Aalto, the architect in Finland. And I continued to be interested in him. And when I was working in Zurich, I had a conversation with him because he was in Zurich for other kinds of business. And I talked with him, and he said I wanted to work in his studio. He says, well, I don't know, but why do you want to be in Finland? You come from Hawaii, which is very interesting.
Whole different environment.
Yeah. But that was my beginning. We was going to see most of his projects.
Right.
And I spent some time in the early 60s. That was my first trip to Finland, and it was an incredible kind of experience to see all the stuff we saw slides of, but to see the real thing.
Right.
And of course, subsequent trips we were also as fascinating.
And it's different being in the actual place as
Yeah,
opposed to
yeah.
reading about it or seeing it
Hmm.
and really living that lifestyle
Mhm.
elsewhere too.
Yeah, that was part of the European experience, and I remember further on down the line, I kept importing fixtures, but they weren't able to importing fixtures from Europe, which didn't quite align with electrical systems in the United States.
Oh.
So I had them shipped to the company Peerless Lighting, and I don't know if they're still around. And they changed the lighting fixtures to be adapted.
Make it compatible.
Yeah, right.
So from doing these residential projects, I imagine you start to kind of have a sense of what you really like in architecture and the kinds of things that you want to implement in your designs.
Yeah, well the thing I learned and throughout all of this traveling and even going back to my days at Penn was how design can be so specific. And of course, being from this place, which is incredible, the place is incredible, the quality of light is incredible, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's a very special place.
Right.
And that helped me to develop certain things in doing design. This is a very, very special place. It was, it still is, it's changing, but it has to do that.
Has to adapt. But you're talking a little bit about the specialness of Hawaii, and like you mentioned, the quality of light and air is different here. In 2004, your practice has grown a lot, and now we're going to dive into Case Middle School, which is actually one of your really well-known projects, and for a good reason. You have talked to us a little bit about how good design relates to being very site conscious and being very aware of the environment. In terms of sustainable design, can you talk a little bit about your design approach to Case? And like you had mentioned, actually, sustainability wasn't the word per se at the time.
One of the professors at the University of Pennsylvania was Ian McHarg, and he gave weekly lectures to everyone. And that time it was called ecology. And we learned a lot because he also influenced his other members of faculty there. So it became really part of the curriculum. And again, fast forward, we did the Punahou PE complex in the mid-70s started. And, again, Hawaii being a special place, the light is different, the climate is different, and the environment is different. And so we tried to reflect that. I think, that was the first major project at Punahou, I guess. And then continuing on, in Case Middle School, the technology has had improved since then, and but again, our approach was to incorporate all of that into the design.
That was kind of the driving concept, if you will, for Case Middle School. And it was pretty fun since we had just come from Case Middle School, and you actually gave us the whole tour of Case Middle School, as well as the Punahou site in general. And I think one of the important things you mentioned was being able to relate the design to what is surrounding it and what is outside of it, and what are the experiences of those that are coming in and those that are in the space looking out. Can you tell us a little bit about design decisions you made to keep those connections out into the rest of the site?
Well, it's important in any project to try to understand the history of the site, whether it's good or bad. And having been part of Punahou for many years, growing up there since kindergarten, there are parts of it which should relate to whatever we did. And in all of the work we did at Punahou, it was very much part of our concept,
Right.
Oh, because what we do, it belongs to the history of the school.
It'll stay with it
Yeah.
after its completion. Right. You had mentioned on site about being intentional about trade winds and making sure that the breeze was captured in the design, that the orientation of the buildings weren't going against it, but were helping.
Well, all of that is part of the ecology. The trade winds come from a certain direction, the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously these are very important things to consider. Now, I think you saw at the PE facility is clear story lighting, again facing north, so there's no need for artificial lighting during the day, and on and on and on. But that's what we have tried to do in all of these projects. And it's called sustainability now, and technology allows you to do many more things, which as it should be.
I think what's really interesting about it is that you and the professionals at the time really had consciousness of approaching design in that way, and that was really before all of these lead metrics were in place. But really, that wasn't necessarily what you guys were designing for. It wasn't that you were making these decisions to obtain a certain certification or a certain plaque per se. It was kind of the approach that you guys just had to the design.
Well, the design came first, Jill, and then the criteria for LEED certification came a little bit afterwards. Like the orientation of the buildings was set up before LEED, in terms of sun rises in the east, sets in the west, et cetera, et cetera. And these were the most important things. And then, of course, LEED was, they just began the criteria for LEED design. And, as I mentioned to you earlier, we had grates in front of the entry doors for students to wipe the snow off the feet. Well, that was part of it.
Non-existent Hawaiian snow.
As part of the design case, that there's some things we did not do, which we could have done, like change the temperature of the lights, et cetera, but I was concerned with the entire Punahou facade along Wilder Avenue. For example, all of, again, pulse and light fixtures begin from the science building all the way along to past Case.
And that was to kind of tie in the whole facade, the existing with the new. Right.
So not everything was done for LEED certification, which I'm not sure that happens much today. People are too interested in getting net zero, et cetera, et cetera. But the architectural design is as important, I think.
Compared to just striving for a certain point system and metric. I share the same sentiment about metrics and certifications. I think they provide a good guideline to kind of evaluate a project or evaluate a design, but striving for points isn't the goal of architecture. We're designing for people and we're designing for these places. There's a big difference between projects that are accomplished design-wise and also have passed those metrics compared to projects that are only aspiring to achieve certain points. There's a difference in the quality of design and the intentionality of it. And I think it's a good challenge for designers to still be conscious about design and put design at the forefront. We're on the topic of Case Middle School, and earlier at Punahou, you actually showed us the other buildings that you worked on as well. Can you talk to me a little bit about the unique learning environments here in Hawaii and how are they different from some of the schools that you've seen in the mainland and maybe internationally too?
Well, nationally and internationally, I don't quite understand the process that they went through, but what we did specifically at Punahou and other educational institutions is obviously involve many people.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically at CASE, we went to school for about a year and a half, every Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, where this committee of faculty, administration, and physical plant people met. And we discussed and defined what the program for what a Punahou middle school should be. And that's what eventually evolved.
Right.
Discussion with all of these different parties. In the past, we did the same thing, again, part of Punahou, the Mumia Science Center. We began again working with faculty and administration. And this is all very important part of doing the design, because our approach to design is that initial concepts evolve depending upon many different factors.
Right.
And that's precisely what happened with all of the projects at Punahou. Most of the projects we've worked on, actually.
How do you balance out all of the requests? Because I know there's a lot of different people, a lot of different needs and components. How do you, as an architect, kind of synthesize?
You listen to them and you convince them otherwise. Yeah, I think that's part of the process.
Yeah.
And, many of the faculty members are retired now, but I still see them around town, and they still remember what it was like to work on CASE. So, that's I think,
and I think
that's what it is.
Vital.
Yeah?
That's very important, because those are the people that are going to be using it anyway. And so it has to kind of come from them so that the architecture is serving the people that are using it.
I think what's happening now is that people want to Google everything, and they say, well, why can't we do this? And so you have 10 people saying 10 different things about why can't we do this, and that's what makes it, I think, very difficult today. But again, that's the nature of technology.
But it's nice, I guess, as an architect, you're able to help them make an informed decision about the space.
Yeah. I think that's important what you said, an informed decision, because some of the comments you hear are not informed.
It's hard to vet them out, huh?
Yep.
But at least from my perspective, looking at some of the plans, I kind of see this village concept almost where, and maybe it's the nature of how CASE Middle School is supposed to serve different grade levels.
Well, that was a concept that was arrived at by this steering committee, so to speak, about to create a village. And that's what it is. It's a different kind of community. Other middle schools, I don't think is that separated. I may be mistaken, but that's what we arrived at as a committee, I think. And well, amazing thing, it works today. It still works.
Yeah.
Continues to work, I think.
Right. It's all separate yet interconnected. And on site today, we were talking about how life also happens in those middle spaces.
Yes.
That life and activity happens in that circulation space. That's kind of the gap in the middle of these
Yeah,
buildings.
the important thing about, well, when you do a building, it's not only the building that is important, but the space between buildings is important. And most of the projects we worked on, that really counts for a lot. You saw that case, courtyards in between, again, very important. And, different kind of courtyards in the science building, you know, in different kind of spaces in the PE facility. So, this kind of gray space is very important. So,
and it's nice that some of the function has stayed and some spaces have been kind of transformed through the generations, yet it's still serving a similar purpose.
Well, that's always something difficult to do. But we began with, I think at Punahou, with the science building of just these spaces which had no name, and then continued on with CASE, and they become another kind of learning center, which is, part of the educational system, I think.
So you talked earlier about having those discussion meetings with the faculty at Case Middle School and really forming the design, and that seems to be a positive memory that you have from the design process working at Case. Are there other lasting memories that you have from that experience that you want to share? Anything that you guys may have done during construction, or memories of, when the project was in progress?
Well, I think a lasting memory is the entire process we went through. And the defining the program, and working with the contractor, defining the construction, and finally, at the end, it's the Case Middle School. To this day, the people who were teaching there come up to me and say, "Hey, that's the most memorable thing they've had, teaching at Case," which, you can't beat that, right?
Yeah. That's amazing. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people go into architecture. It's because you leave behind this tangible thing that people can enjoy and generations can appreciate down the line. And it really is a lasting positive impact. And John, on site today, you showed me a little area where you signed your name at Case Middle School. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Well, Steve Piper and I worked very closely on the entire project from day one, and towards the end, they're pouring the concrete curb. So we said, "Hey, I got this great idea. We're going to sign our names." Okay. So that's what we did. We signed our names.
Left your mark.
Right.
Right there. Directly.
Right.
That's awesome. That was a great treat. It was very unexpected too. And it's not very loud, so it's kind of like a little treasure that you find as you're walking along.
Well, I have a picture of me and Steve, actually last year, standing next to it.
That's awesome.
We're standing on it. It's refreshing to see after, these many years that it still functions, I think, very well, or at least to my knowledge. And, I think that's about as good as you can expect,
And it's well maintained.
Yeah, it's well maintained, and people care about it. That's very important.
Yeah.
This new second, third generation of teachers, they love it. So, and they weren't part of the original ones, but they still love it, which is, I think, very important.
And I think part of that adoration and love for a space is because they realize the intentionality behind the design.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And how you mentioned that the community faculty were involved in the decision making, I think it's a huge deal, because in that sense they're also leaving their mark on this space, and they're taking ownership of it.
That's true.
That's really awesome to be able to have that. Yeah, it was great being at Case Middle School today.
What do you see happening in architectural design now, relative to getting other people involved?
When I was a student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, one of our design projects was actually community-focused design. I would say maybe about half of that studio was focused on research. And by research, I mean going up to the occupants of that space, asking them what are the needs of the space, what doesn't work, and what does work, what needs to be changed. And as a student, it was a good exercise for me to be conscious that, again, we're not just designing these sculptures per se, we're designing buildings that people will use and occupy. It was really valuable that our studio went through that process of interviewing the building users, interviewing the surrounding building occupants, and also taking time to be in the space and experience it for ourselves. I thought that was something that, as a professional, I want to carry on into my practice. From my professional experiences, there is still that desire to seek what the occupants are wanting and what the users are wanting for a space. Maybe it's more pertinent for different typologies. So I think for a school, for sure, there's a more conscious effort to seek out the users of the space in terms of the design. Some of the work that I'm seeing happening in Hawaii, thankfully, that's still something that's being practiced.
We've done that in different forests for mostly all of the projects. I think that's only one part of the design process. Another important part, I think, is a history of, on a big scale, of where we are and what has been done, good or bad. Okay, and again, in my experience, from Penn, learning about history from Venturi and Jurgala and et cetera, history is very important. And I think a greater emphasis should be applied to that. I mean, I don't know if they have any history instructors anymore at the university, but they definitely should.
Right. I think they have it available, but maybe not as easily accessible. And the other downside, I guess, in our other conversations that the two of us have had, is there's a pressure for time and deadlines, and sometimes that kind of gets in the way of spending a little bit more time on the design and history and research.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when we're talking about history. In my first year at Penn, the history of architecture class, we drew by hand plans of the Gothic cathedrals.
Wow.
And I still have those drawings. And, that was part of the curriculum and part of the mindset at that time of trying to understand full on the history of architecture.
You should frame those drawings, John.
Yeah, I should.
That would be really nice. What year were you as a student? At
Freshman year.
Freshman year.
In those days, first of all, I didn't know what a row house was. I didn't know what a Gothic cathedral was either. So,
coming from music background too.
Well, not only that,
I'm glad that you had a good experience revisiting Case Middle School today. I had a great time as well. Now looking back at it after all these years, and throughout the course of your practice, you've seen architecture evolve over the last 60 years. How do you feel about the future evolution of Case Middle School and maybe Punahou as a whole?
Well, I think what's happening at Case Middle School from the very beginning and how it's evolved is, quote, right, end quote, way to do that. I mean, it accomplishes what the intent always was. It's an environment for education, and that's very important. And no matter what other people do around, it still is that. People learn.
Do you think there is a wrong way for architecture to evolve?
Oh, sure. When people turn something into what it's not supposed to be. That happens all the time.
When they miss the intent.
It never serves. It doesn't function as well.
Right.
It never will.
the blueprint has changed. So to
That's
say.
correct.
So, John, you mentioned a lot about architectural history as being very important and something you feel needs to be a part of conversations more. Tell me about your thoughts on why you feel architecture needs to have more conversations between professionals, between clients, between the community.
Well, I think it's very important. When I first started my office, as part of Group 70, we used to have these solve the world problems. We used to stay overnight go to a beach house or something and just talk about it. And that's what we did,
And you showed me those photographs of you guys.
Yeah, it was incredible. Now people, at least I noticed this at the university, they don't talk to each other. They send them emails even though they're sitting 10 feet away. And again, the idea of live conversation is very important. And I think it's also important, well, even in the AIA, it's more fun to meet together.
Together in person.
Right.
And sharing that camaraderie.
That's right. That's right. But, again, technology, and the COVID thing obviously had an effect, but we need to get back to what it was.
Right. How would you encourage, I guess, emerging professionals like myself to seek out more experienced architects like yourself and start kind of these conversations similar to what we're having now?
Well, I think one of the major differences now is when I was just out of school, we had heroes.
Heroes.
Alva Aalto, Le Corbusier, Jorn Utzon, etc., etc. And we followed, everything, but we learned all about them. I think that's somewhat missing today because there are many more architects, but that's not to say that you can't learn. And the important thing is, I think, dialogue. You can't just send emails or Google something. It's dialogue that's very important.
And walking through,
right.
and even passing on lessons learned from projects. Yeah, it's very vital. John, what do you think the future of architectural design in Hawaii should be focused on? Or maybe where do you think it's headed?
I think architectural design in Hawaii should, be designed by people living in Hawaii. I think a lot of the work being done now is done by, quote, architects coming from the mainland and the local offices. They make a lot of money, but they like to do the working drawings. And, I think that it should be the other way around. In my experience, some of my contemporaries, we were doing the design here. They made a difference. Because we live here, we understand what the hell's going on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Coming from the mainland, people don't really know. And as I mentioned earlier, I think in another conversation, one of the historians at Penn said, there was a time when Philadelphia looked like Philadelphia. New York looked like New York. Boston looked like Boston. That's not happening anymore. This whole world is beginning to look alike. But that's not to say that we can't modify that somewhat, because we live in a special place with a special climate and special environment. And I think that's important.
Yeah. And I think people recognize that. I know for myself and my peers, there is still a desire to come home.
That's right. And again, you come home, right? That's important.
And it's always different, to be able to do good work in the place that you live in your home, and to have a say in what happens to the place. And I think it's very important. And I would hope that many of the aspiring architects will also stay in Hawaii. You know, those that have grown up here and have studied here, that they would
Sure.
have the opportunity to stay in Hawaii and
Well, I
design.
also think it's vitally important that the people who are born and raised here, educated here, go away, travel, see the world.
Mm-hmm.
That's as important. But the fact is that you live here, you know what life is here like. Therefore, you should go to other places to see how other people live.
That's great advice to give. What other advice would you give to architects of the future as technology kind of continues to evolve and merge with the profession? What would you advise them to do, or how should they approach this kind of merging of technology with architecture?
You have to begin to think of what architecture means to you.
Hmm.
Okay, and once you do that, then that in itself sets a direction.
Right.
You know, like if you like technology, fine. And if you like construction manager, that's fine. I mean, there was never a course before in the university curriculum of construction management. Architectural profession is such that there's so many different categories, you know. But, and it has to happen that way because there's so many people and technology has changed.
Mm-hmm.
But you just have to pick up what you think is most important.
Mm-hmm.
Do the best you can.
You know, your core beliefs and your core intentions have that drive,
Mm-hmm.
your vision for architecture. And I think that's why it's important to have these kinds of conversations, is because it matters what the previous sentiments were from past architects,
Mm-hmm.
I think, and you know, their approach to design and their view of architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And for a young aspiring professional, it's important to set those beliefs going forward and at least be conscious about why we do certain things and why we make certain decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I think, as another core value, so to speak, would be to understand where we are, where we live,
Mm-hmm.
what the culture is like.
Mm-hmm.
That's very important because no matter where you go, this place is home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's different.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and even if you come from elsewhere, emerging professionals should try to understand what the culture is like here,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not where you come from.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
It's different. It's not
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah.
And there's a specialness about Hawaii,
Yeah.
and a lot of people recognize that.
Yeah. And there are people who were never born and raised here, but they live here now, and their contributions are incredible.
Mm-hmm.
That's important, you know.
And I think it's because they make the effort to
That's
value
right. That's
and
right.
experience it. Yeah.
That's right. Because you don't have to be born here to do good architecture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But you need to have that heart
Yeah.
to want to do it,
Yeah. Sure.
to be right with people, and to be right with Hawaii.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What principles do you believe emerging professionals should embody as they design Hawaii?
Well, again, we touched on it, though, and one is understanding where we live, the history of where we live.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not because you're going to recreate the history, but just know about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and again, know why this place is so special.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it rarely snows here, and that's incredible. It rains, but doesn't rain like it does in Florida. You know, and on and on. So that's why when you go away, it's great to come back here,
Mm-hmm.
and it's great to go away too to see how the other places, see how how the rest of the world lives. you see different things, you eat different things, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and especially for the younger people, because you know, when you get to be old, you do things in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
You have to do things in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're young, when you're an emerging professional, quote unquote, you have all of these different kinds of options to pursue, and I think that's the great thing about being young. You know,
Take advantage of it.
yeah,
And go for it.
Yeah, sure. You have to do that
Mm-hmm.
because the world's not going to go back
Mm-hmm.
to what it was.
Thank you so much, John, for joining us today. On behalf of AIA Honolulu and the Emerging Professionals Committee, we would like to just extend a big thank you for the opportunity to talk story with you today. We'll see you all in the next one. Ahui ho! That was the end for us.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
I need my nap.
You did it.